tight one? No. Okay. We're rolling.
John knows the one. Yeah. You know how to, we get the blood.
For sync. Okay. Mister, do you prefer Alex or Alec?
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter?
Doesn't matter.
We'll switch depending
My
on
name is Alexander.
Alexander.
Alexander po-ukrainsky.
Can you spell that for us?
Alexander?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can spell it too because you're probably better at spelling than Alexander is actually the right name.
And your last name?
Kravetz.
And how do you spell that?
We in Canada, with Dad had a different name when he came to Canada, because we went into Poland, to Gdańsk, and that's where he registered to come to Canada. And in Poland, they added an IEC in the Kravetz, the present name. So when Dad got here, he had a problem with cream cans when they used to ship cream cans, because we used to milk cows by hand, and of course they had a separator, cream separator, and they would separate the cream from the milk. And when they shipped the cream to the creamery here, there were other people from Boyle that had the same names, spelt the same and everything else, and they would mix up their cream cans. So then Dad went and dropped off the I out of the Krawec, there was an IEC. So he dropped the I out and he just spelled it as Kravetz, and that's the reason it is. It should be actually Krawetz, Kravetz, the Ukrainian name. And from then on, Dad never bothered changing, and we as the family kept the same name. We haven't changed our name, so it's Kravetz actually is what it is. But yeah.
So Mr. Kravetz, where are we sitting and standing today?
Today, right here is the original 1936. In 1936, when this community hall was built, there used to be water over here. You could hardly drive into this area because this was a little higher spot. That's the reason they built the hall there. Over in the yonder, this was all big timber country, big spruce, poplar, whatever type of wood, plants that they used to grow. And the farmers that came here from Ukraine, I think Canada was pretty smart to invite the Ukrainian people to Canada because they knew that Canadians were real good farmers. They farmed in the homeland in Ukraine, and they came here and they developed Canada to the state that it's at today.
And tell me about the hall we're sitting in front of.
The hall was started to build in 1936. I was one of the youngsters that was helping my dad and other parents that were involved in the community, and they used to call it the Prosvita Hall. Prosvita Hall means enlightenment. Prosvita means enlightenment, to learn, to expand the knowledge, I guess, and whatever requirements there are. I remember the time that Dad went to town one day, and he went to a store, and there was a customer that come to Falconer's store. It was an old store, and they needed a crosscut saw, so they came to the store, and they said, to me, to you, it's just by motion kind of thing, to buy a saw. They wanted a saw to be able to saw down trees and whatever. And, our parents had to, I guess, I don't really know the proper name to call it or to name it. But, our parents had a terrifically hard time because of not knowing the language, the foreign English language that was being used in Canada. My mother never learned English until my brother John, my youngest brother, there were 7 of us in the family, he married an English girl. Her father's name or her surname was Turner. So Brother John got to know her, and I guess they fell in love and they got married. And my sister-in-law, Sandy was her name, Sandra actually. She lived with Dad and Mom for 2 years and Brother John together, and that's why where my brother or my mother learned a little bit of English. And she got to know that because of her daughter-in-law living with her. You know, our parents went into very difficult times, through very difficult times, because of the fact that the language was a big barrier, and even their traditional things that they did, and how they did them, were really hard for other different nationalities that came to Canada to understand the Ukrainian people, because they were a people of one traditional, I guess, life, you might call it, because of the way they farmed in Ukraine, the traditional things that they did. Even the gardening was something that all of Canada was learning from the Ukrainian people, because they were a people of the land, you might say.
Let me ask you, Alex.
Yes.
We call this place a place for enlightenment. What is involved with enlightenment? Because when I think of enlightenment, I think of education, but I also think of spiritual
Yes.
education. Was that included here as well?
Yes, it was. We had services. Our priests we had the Ukrainian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Catholic priests coming. They would both faith had their church services here, if you like, but on different, of course, different holidays or different Sundays, you know. So, but the community used this hall as a place of learning, place of enlightenment, like you said, and and a place of getting together. That was the big issue here. All the people in the community come here, regardless of what nationality, what belief, or what language. We all got together, Polish, English, whatever, you know, and we were all community workers trying to, I guess, work towards one goal, and that is to improve the country of Canada.
Let me ask you, so where does, you said you were involved in building this?
Yes, I was.
Was George Riga as well?
No, George was younger than me. George was, I don't know, about 5 years younger?
Okay.
5 or 6. I was born in 1928, or 29, sorry, 29. I was 44. I was about 9 months old when we come to Canada in 1930, and George was born here. His dad came here with the Pizzarco family, which one of the Pizzarco girls become my wife later in years, and George Riga come along with them, or not George Riga, sorry. George was here about 3 years before my parents came to Canada. His wife Mary came with the Pizzarco family, and that was when George and Mary got to know one another because of the community here, you know, and community activities. And they decided, I guess, to get married. So they had their son George, and then they had a daughter named Annie.
So, Alex, in the context of George's life and career, where would you situate this building as far as somewhere that maybe he learned from others, or did he also offer his knowledge here? Where would this be situated in his life and career?
And the hall, the community hall itself, was George's parents never really associated with the community as far as organization activities were concerned. George was a little bit more of I think he was more of a, um, I don't know how to say it exactly. George was always of George's dad was always of the communist movement, you know, in the belief of the communist movement. In the Ukraine, in Ukraine, the politics were, there were two sides, you know. There were the the supporting the country, and there were some that wanted Russia to come in and take rule. So that's where George's dad was of that belief, that he felt that the socialist, I wouldn't say the communist system, but I would say more like the socialist system. They believed in a little more socialist movement as far as government is concerned. So George participated in here at this hall because of the school age that he was going through here. He finished grade 8 in the Richmond Park, where he went on. I think he went on to further education in Athabasca and whatever future, because I lost track of George after we parted school here.
But what was the significance of, what do you think he took from this specific location?
George Riga himself?
How did this community hall shape him as the writer that he would become, you think?
You know, I don't know if this hall was really involved. We had Sunday school here, Ukrainian Sunday school, because our parents were none speaking English. So they all spoke Ukrainian. And as far as George is concerned, he was a younger generation. He was of my generation. And we never really associated that much with our parents. We did things the way they asked us to do them, I guess, or told us to do. But we still had our own, as youngsters, we had our own, I don't know, attitude, I guess, towards the development of the community.
So if the family in an English-speaking home, to produce a champion English writer would be kind of a normal thing, but we're talking about a kid who grew up in a home that didn't speak English, somehow later years becomes this champion of the English language and really the champion of the experience of the Canadian.
Yes.
A boy whose parents just got here, right? So
that's right.
So I guess the community center would be a place where you really, you didn't learn a lot of these things from home. You learned them from other community members, right?
The school mainly. Mainly the school. The community hall was used more for social gatherings and stuff like that. The school was the place that the educational ideas and learning came from.
Did he ever read any of his poetry here?
Not locally so much. George participated in outer, you know, because people got to know George, and George was a very smart boy, you know. I grew up with George, and George in school was grade A, or markings are the best you could get in school, because he was a smart child, and it just came naturally, I guess, to him. You know, I couldn't try to compete with George in his essays, and especially literature and essay, and that he just excelled in it very greatly.
Was he a rebel when he was a kid in school?
No.
He wasn't?
No. George was a pretty, I would say, an everyday student. He participated in the things that he was asked to do. He would do his homework or whatever education there was. You know, in the olden days, we had the blackboards in the schools, and that's where the teacher would do the writing, and George would pick it up off the board, and he would put it in his book or his scribbler or whatever he had, and he was just a smart child all the way through.
Do you have memories of a lot of people squeezed into this little building here?
Yes,
Like how many people at one time and for what?
I would say that about probably 75 would be the maximum that it could hold, So it would be full at times.
For
And
what? For what?
community gatherings. We had a community member, a family, the Krush family. The Krush family is, I don't know if you know what a Krush is, but it's a big beetle that they call it in Ukrainian Krush. And that's where this Krush family come. And Mr. Krush was a choir director. He was a pretty knowledgeable individual from the Ukraine because he got some pretty good education. I understood that the grading system was about the level of grade 7 here here in Canada.
What was the community like? Can you give me a sense of how many people were around, how far out you were spread, how long it would take to get here from different homesteads?
When Mom and Dad used to take the family to a concert at the hall here, they'd wrap the children all, and when they'd bring them to the hall, Mom would wrap the children, because they were kids yet, little kids, and they would lay them down underneath the benches in the hall, and that's where they'd be sleeping while the parents were entertaining themselves with a concert or whatever activity was going on in the community hall here.
How long did it take you to get here from where you live?
I used to walk to school for over an hour and a half probably, every day, morning and night. There were times when Mom, one day I never learned Little Bo Peep in school. So Mrs. Day, our teacher here at Richmond Park, kept me after school. And she kept me after school and she forgot about me in the school. But she had a couple of girlfriends that were, grown-up girls, 16, 17-year-old. And because it was a one-room school, that she would associate with the bigger girls, in school, and she forgot about me. So she came to the school at 5 o'clock and it was already dark, because the days get shorter. So I was walking home from school and I met my mother with a lantern, A lantern, I don't know if you know what that is, but she was coming to school, on the way to school to look for me because she thought I got lost. Anyway, she found me halfway home. So we got back home. But no, times have changed terrifically, and it's really hard to, I guess, explain to the individual that didn't go through or experience the situation. It was quite a livelihood to live through. I used to have, I have to tell you this story. I had a dog team of 3 dogs, and I built a little toboggan. I have pictures of it too. And what you call it, I took my mother to the store. We had Budner's store, which was just a half a mile south of here. And we came to get 100 pounds of flour. And I brought Mother with me, and I sat my mother in the toboggan and my 3 dogs, and we got to the store. We bought this 100 pounds of flour, and I put the flour in the bottom of the toboggan, and I sat my mother on the bag of flour, and we were going home with the dog team. We went down about, probably over half a mile east over here, because the old road used to be over there in that brush line, and used to go east to Dad's and Mom's place. And on the way in the wintertime, the snow drift would drift, and then it would create kind of pockets of snowdrift and then nothing, because it was just the way the wind current carried the snow and piled it up, So anyway, my mother was riding in the toboggan on top with a bag of flour, and my dogs got going past the neighbor's yard, and the dogs on the yard started to bark, so my dogs got excited and they started to run. And of course, they tipped my mother out of the toboggan and the bag of flour on top of Mom. And I was 14, I think 14 or 13 or 14 years old. And I had to take Mother and sit her up again, but she wouldn't ride in the toboggan again on top of the flour. She just walked home the rest of the way.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Dina, anything that this specific location, or do you want to give them the book?
Yeah. Alex,
Yes.
this is the first book that George Riga published.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to wreck our lawn arrangement here. It's called Song of My Hands. And
This is the first time I see this book.
I know, very rare book.
Yeah.
And in this, he wrote a poem. Very short, but I'm going to read it to you.
Good.
And what we want to do is, I want you to hold the book, and we're going to have a voice over. It might even be my voice. I don't know. But
Good.
somebody will be reading it, but I want you just to be holding the book and looking at it. But I'm going to read you the poem to a fellow writer. So I pretend that Riga's writing this to me. Keep your feet upon the ground, though clouds play in your raven hair, and fingers every star and snare. For you will lose your buoyant heart when fancies earth and sky surpass, yet you forget the feel of grass. The cynic foes you fight today forgot the hills and sunlit streams, forgot the people and their dreams. So work as 10, for you are young, but keep your pen to heavens hurled, reflecting truth within the world.
Now, to me, that verse or that poem that he wrote is somebody that's probably a full age of life.
But you know what? He was young when he wrote it.
I know.
But it sounds like a sage, an old sage, doesn't
That's
it?
right. That's right.
What I'd like you to do is, we're going to get, I just want you to hold the book and maybe look at it. And
Open
we're
up.
go-
Open it up.
Yeah, and we're going to film you looking at it, and I'll get out of the way.
Why?
And I thought it would be appropriate for Prosvita Hall because it's like a gathering place of the people.
It was.
Yeah.
You know, as my view and my assessment, I guess, of George Riga is that he was a very talented child. He was a very talented boy, and in his schoolwork, when I was in school with him, he was one of the first students that would always come up with an A grading of his lessons. So to me, it meant that he was a very smart boy, smart child, and I stayed in touch with George, I guess, until the time that he had the job at the Athabasca here at the bridge, and then he went to work for CFRN, and I lost contact with George because he went into two different worlds. I went to be a homesteader and a farmer, whereas George went into the outer world, and he was, I guess, smart enough and knowledgeable enough to come up with the product that he has come up with. So that's about the extent of my, my knowledge of George.
That's fine. But that book, that's nice, the way you're holding it. John, dear, can you get a picture of Alex?
And Alex,
Yes.
Can you just kind of read through it? Just look at the words, and I'm just gonna zoom in and get your hands.
The contents. Song of my hands, prairie wind, sunrise, my land, the river story or the river storm in Finland's woods, lines written on a morning walk when the sun gets high, of what consequence? Now, even a statement like that, to me, it seems that he had something in mind that not the normal person would have.
Like, explain that.
George had, I guess, from my view, I guess George had the ability to recognize and know the difference in the different circumstances of a lifetime in life, and he had the ability to differentiate that, because George was really a smart student, as I said before, and I have to give him credit, and I think many people do give George the credit of his ability to put into words into a book like this.
Even as a young man,
That's
speaking
right.
as though he's 90 years old, imparting the knowledge that it took him a lifetime to collect.
I don't know.
How is he able to be so mature and sage-like as such a young man?
That I cannot give judgment on, because I don't know what is supernatural, you might call it supernatural knowledge, or wherever he got the wisdom from.
Can we get him to read that one poem? Can you find that for me?
Which is that one?
It's got the card in it.
Let's just get you, if you don't mind, Alex, just to read the one poem.
This one.
Yeah, but
Oh, yeah.
To a fellow writer.
you just be looking in that.
Okay.
camera.
We're there.
Okay. So actually, here, might
I-
go by this camera, make sure it's okay. I'm going to just move around. Okay, Alex, whenever you're ready. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep your feet upon the ground, though clouds play in your ravened hair. The fingers every star in snares, for you will lose your buoyant heart. When fancies earth and sky surpass, yet you forget the feel of grass. The cynic foes you fight today forgot the hills and sunlight streams, forgot the people and their dreams, so work as 10, for you are young, but keep your pen to heavens hurled, reflecting truth within the world.
Nice. Great job.
Thank you.
Very nice. Anything else here? We've done.
But
three.
you know, just looking at this booklet right now, this fellow or George had to have some type of really unexplainable thoughts in his mind.
He did.
I,
He did.
you know,
It's remarkable.
yep,
And you remember we were looking at pictures and you said he
Yeah.
was troubled
Yeah.
because
he was thinking all the time.
all the time. All the time.
Yeah.
Yep.
George,
We're done at this site.
Okay.
great. Thank you very much. So, my dad and mom got married, and they were thinking of their future family. And they said, you know, there's 3 of us, and dad was a part owner of 20 acres that his dad when he passed away, my dad was 14 years old. He had 20 acres of land. Between the George Riga's dad became a socialistic inclined thinker,
Right.
you know, and he thought that the betterment would be to go to the socialist government for the Ukraine, like.
Right.
But
Right. He found it. Yes, I understand that.
yeah, so my parents actually did not have too much alternative, knowing that they're going to raise a family. They were young people. They're going to, how are they going to provide or try to provide for the whole family when it grows up, you know?
Would Riga's family have had the same thought process?
I would think so. They were in a similar position.
Were they from the same place in the Ukraine?
I don't think they're from the same village, but I don't know what village Rigas came from. I don't know.
I've got it.
Okay, we're ready to go. Oh, I'm already recording. What do you know? Okay, so let's continue on here. Gina, let's do
Okay.
this together.
You know what, Alex? One of his best stories about George Riga, and this is the one that he's promised to tell in great detail. And this is the one that has never appeared in any publication. This is the first time you're going to hear it, and I think it's a very important story about the land lottery.
Okay, then can you tell us the story of the land lottery, Alex?
Yes,
Okay.
George and another neighbor of mine that lived half a mile north of my place, my folks' place, was Ed Mochid. And the three of us were all pretty well the same age, and we were graduating from Athabasca or Richmond Park School, and we wanted to look at some future. So we decided to apply for a homestead. And the way this come about is the quarter section that I own was a quarter section that was reserved by the Alberta government, the social credit government at that time. In 1936 took power in Alberta, as you're well aware of, and we wanted a homestead because there was really no jobs available except maybe going in the wintertime to the bush to work in a lumber camp, or else go and try and find some farm work for the different farmers that have had some work available for laborers. This was very hard to find because the farmers in those days were still all very small. They hardly had any land available that was in big enough amounts to hire people to work for them. So they just tried to do the best they could by themselves. Now, this one time, George, when my quarter section became available, was because there was a big fire went through it that happened to get away on a neighbor that was clearing land south of my quarter section by the name of Bill Krusch. And when he lit the fire, the wind turned from the south, and he didn't expect it to turn from that direction, but it did. And his brush pile, when he had them burning, that were true sparks onto my quarter section. That was all big timber. It was all the spruce timber, standing spruce timber that the government had reserved, as I said before, for the people the immigrants that were moving in. And after the fire in 1950, myself, George Riga, and Eddie Mockett decided to go to the city to make application for this homestead. There were two quarters available. There was my quarter section and the one just north adjacent to my place. And there were three of us that were interested in them. So we all three went to Edmonton to the Department of Lands and Forests. We got to the Department of Lands and Forests in Edmonton. We put our they put our names in a little strip of paper and put it in a hat. And then they made us draw, and the one that drew number one had his first choice of the 2/4 sections, and the second one, of course, was the second quarter that was available. I happened to be the lucky one, I guess, or I don't know if you call it lucky or not. I sure got myself a lot of work when I got to Homestead, and I drew number one. So I took the southeast to 32, 68, 21 was the quarter section that I chose. The second draw was, of course, left over, and George didn't get the draw, but Eddie Mock had got one. So he took the second quarter. And that's how I personally landed up in 1950 with a homestead. And from then on, I was already dating a girl for 6 years, and I thought it was just about time to get married. So she agreed to get married. We got married, and we lived for 2 years with my mom and dad, and that's where my son Terry was born, at his grandpa and his grandma's place. We lived there with him for 2 years, and after 2 years, I started to clear a spot with my wife while living with dad and mom, a spot for building a house and developing some yard area. And that's how we started from there. From there on, we just continued laboring. We made, after I got the homestead, a year later, my brother and Pete and I bought.
Okay, I'm here with Alex. I'm here with Alex, and we're going to do a little more talking.
Good.
Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about how things happen in people's lives, and you don't think of it at the time, but it can have a huge effect. Now, I want to go back and explore the lottery story a little bit more.
Oh.
You already told it, but what I want to take a look at and what I want to talk with you about is the effect. You said that George lost.
Well,
What if things would have turned out differently? What say if Ed had lost and George got the land and he'd be your neighbor?
I don't know. It's hard to visualize in advance because you don't really know the thinking of the individual at the time, for one thing.
Yeah.
Because I think when George was going with us to Edmonton for the draw of the 2/4 sections that were available at that time, I really can't visualize what route George would have taken, whether it's into commercial or what type of business he would have chose, whether he would have stayed with his probably preferred knowledge that he was believing in. And I think George, whatever field he would have gone into, George would have made a success. And the reason I'm saying this, I think that George himself was a smart individual, and he knew what he wanted in life. He knew how to express it, because of some of his writings and some of his acts that he performed in the community. George was pretty broad-minded, and he thought about things quite widely. His actual belief was to support the poorer individual. He always believed that people should have the opportunity to succeed, and in some cases this did not really happen. Some people succeeded quite well, whether it's because of political reasons or whether it's because of the the effort that they put into the community that they lived in. It, it, it depended a lot on how you applied yourself, I guess, in life. You know, I I was an individual that believed to support the local community, the local activities, and all the local gatherings that existed in the community at the time. There's a lot of difference today, of course, because of the time change and of the things that have transpired in our political system, whether it's in the Canada country or the community or in the individual life for that matter. You know, we have to consider the fact that we live in a country that gives us certain provisions. And unless we can try and assist in those provisions, it would not happen. We have to live in a country that we support with all our knowledge and more so in our activities, because it's through our efforts and through the activities that we apply ourselves in the community to that we can, I guess, advance.
Right. George Riga went on in 1967. He wrote a play called The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. And this play was produced as a centennial project by the Vancouver Playhouse. In the play, a young Indigenous woman disappears into the city, and she's raped and murdered. George later said in a CBC interview that he worked side by side with itinerant Indigenous farmers from Calling Lake and Wabasca. Can you comment on that?
The community of Calling Lake was a community of native people, and they really didn't have any permanent jobs at the time. And I guess it's still continuing in life because they were always dependent on wanting to get a job and make a dollar and try and live the best they could with the dollar they made. It wasn't easy in those days because the transportation wasn't available as readily as it is today. In those days we had horse and buggy or horse and wagon, and just our own leg transportation, you might say. So therefore, you know, time changes everything, you might say.
Yeah.
Our community lifestyle, our community activities, and the involvement that we partake in.
Who did George listen to?
I don't think I can answer that question, to be very honest with you.
Fair enough.
You know, because I don't know his personal home upbringing. I didn't grow up with him in his home. I grew up in my own family life, my own home, and my parents, there were 6 of us children in the family, and, you know, we had to share life.
And as a son of Ukrainian immigrant farmers and working alongside Indigenous people who, both groups, Ukrainian immigrants and Indigenous people, had their own issues, do you think that would have had an impact on, do you think that might have even caused him to write?
I think George personally was naturally born a very smart individual. And his attitude was towards education, of course. We know that.
Do you think though that he may have wanted to have given the voiceless people a voice?
Yes, I do. I think he worked for some of the individuals that were not outspoken.
Yes.
You know, he tried to speak for them. Not necessarily that everybody would hear him or pay attention to him, but he was there to try and support the average individual that had, something to contribute to life on earth.
I read once that George Riga said that Lord Strathcona pounded in the last spike, but Mike built the railroad.
Oh, yeah, that's a good saying.
Comment on that about how the hardworking Ukrainian
George,
immigrants?
George probably expressed his opinion in many cases, and I think perhaps there was a time and a place that needed that expression and those comments. So I think that George, as a whole, I think George was a fair and minded individual. I think he was a smart individual, and I enjoyed my living at the time George was with us.
Yes. Did you know that his play, Ecstasy of Rita Joe, that we talked about earlier, to this day has outsold any other Canadian play?
No.
There's more copies of it in print and sold,
Mm.
and it's been produced more than any other Canadian play around the world.
Mm.
Did you ever think that that would be a possibility when you went to school with
Well,
him?
probably not.
No.
I put, yes, as an individual, I knew George in our boyhood days. I knew George quite well in our playgrounds at the school and our activities that went on. But as far as his actual background political thinking, I have to say that I did not take George as such an individual.
Yeah.
I somehow, or why I don't know, maybe I didn't work enough with George to get to that understanding.
Or do you think maybe people just part ways naturally? They have different lifestyles.
Of course.
Yeah.
We all have our own way of
Yeah.
thinking, and we all have our own way of expressing things.
Yeah.
And George was one of those individuals that somehow could foresee those kind of situations. And he was, I have to refer to him as a smart individual. And that's why George, I guess, succeeded as well as he could. I personally, and I'm quoting this again, I did talk to George on a kind of an individual basis. And I said to George one day, I said, George, I think if you took the political thinking of our government, I think you would advance very well.
How did he respond?
To be very honestly, he didn't give me an answer to that. I think his dad had quite an influence in George's way of thought, and I think that his dad had quite an influence in George's activities as far as the community, because his dad never was an individual that worked with a group of people in a community. We had some very popular individual as a choir director, and his name was Fred Krusch here in Richmond Park.
I've heard that he was very, very good.
Yes,
Very
he
good
was.
choir director.
Yes, he
Yeah.
was. We sang in Edmonton. We traveled pretty well throughout Alberta with the choir, but that's a side of what we're trying to debate here, I guess. And George just didn't. Well, I think that maybe George didn't partake because of his parents' influence on George. I think that George Riga Sr., George's dad, was quite I don't know if he was a communist or not. I shouldn't say that because I don't know. But I think that he had quite a bit of influence on George's life. That's about all I can tell you.
Yeah. Good.
Do you remember the first time you heard a poem or any piece of writing of George's?
I've heard quite a few of them, yeah.
Do you remember the first time?
Not really, no, I don't know. The first poem you mean, or the first whatever article he wrote?
Do you remember the first time he might have said to you, I like writing, I want to be a writer, or the first time maybe you read something of his and thought, wow, this is different.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember when he went to Banff School of Fine Arts?
Not exactly at the time he went to school. I knew that he went to Banff School of Fine Arts, all right, but I didn't talk to George because of our separation of distance. George lived in the city, I lived out in the country. Our communication was minimal. I did quite a bit of truck driving to the city. I did a lot of livestock hauling, and but I never really had an opportunity to discuss George on a personal level. I would have liked to have had, and I'm very sorry till this day, that I never talked to George about the immediate things of our livelihood right at the home base, you might say.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, I
No,
can't.
that's lots.
Let me ask you, are you still okay? Can
Oh,
we
sure.
ask one more question?
Sure.
I'd like to know if you can summarize what it's like to be a Ukrainian kid whose parents speak Ukrainian, and all of a sudden you're in school learning English, and you're in Canada, and I mean, what's it like? Did you feel displaced? Did you feel in a different world? How did this country kind of make you feel when you were a kid?
Initially, when I started school, I was very dependent on a friend I had, and his name was Nick Shalapai. Not Nick Shalapai, his brother Mike, sorry. Mike Shalapai was 2 years older than me, and he was quite friendly with my family, and the Shalapai family were quite friendly. So when I started school, I kind of depended on Nick to guide me through the beginning days of the school. As far as Nick having an influence on my life, I guess there was a certain amount because of the friendship that we had, because of my parents' friendship that his parents had together. We were quite friendly, and that's the reason when I first started school, I was 8 years old when I first started school, because my parents wouldn't let me go to school because of the distance.
How far?
4.5 miles to walk. So I had, I should tell you this story. When I first started school, I shouldn't say when I first started school, because when we started school, there was a group of us, probably 15 or 20 of us walking together. So I figured out that I'm going to help the children carry their lunch cans. There was no lunch pails or lunch boxes. It was all lunch cans, lard cans and stuff. And I thought I'd get a piece of a stick that had a curve at the end, and that was the end that would slide up on the snow or in the dirt or in the dust. And I'd put nails on that railing and hang the lunch cans of the children that were going to school. I'd hang them on there, and I'd haul them to school that way for the children, because they were smaller kids, and bigger kids. So that was I know that's maybe a poor example, but it's the truth in life, and we all lived through it. I mean, I lived through it. So did the children that partook in the activities with me. And George didn't really associate with us that much because of his distance to school. His distance was only half the distance as I had to walk. George's home was about halfway closer to school than mine. So I kind of had a little bit of a little bit of a feeling, if you like, to the smaller children. I thought that there were smaller children that were a little less fortunate than myself. And maybe that was the reason or not, I don't know, but that's what happened in life. And we went through it. We had to try and share with one another the best we could.
Can you tell me what your experience, the life of the indigenous people around this area was like when you were young? Do you remember?
I remember since after I got to be about 14 years old, then I understood it a lot more. I do know that the native people, I'll call them native people, that they had a hard time too, their life wasn't easy. I brought a family, a young couple, to the farm, my father's and mother's farm, and we had to get them to stay in the granary. A granary has no wall insulations or anything, just a building. But this young couple come, and this young lady was having a baby. And there was no facility of any kind for them or anything. She had to have this baby in that granary, 4 single-sheeted lumber walls, and there she was having her baby. I felt very pathetic towards that, because I thought that, that surely there must be better accommodations for less fortunate people than what we were. Maybe we weren't totally fortunate, and truly enough didn't enjoy all the comfort that there was to be enjoyed in life, but there were less fortunate people than what we were at the time.
Can I ask you about
Yes.
We've heard that the Rigas farm, when they came here and they got their land, was just awful land to plant on. Was that the same with your family?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little, start by saying the region where we are, where the Rigas started their farm, and then tell me just a little about what the landscape was like and how hard it was to farm.
The landscape was the first landscape, the first quarter section that Dad filed as a homestead was divided by 3 creeks. In other words, that 160 acres was divided into what would 3 divided by 160 acres? 80 acres? 80? No, about 60 acres, of land. It was just not enough to keep your business or your farming in contact for you to make a livelihood.
What was the soil like?
Gray wooded soil. We had gray wooded soil, which was a fair soil to grow, your legume crops, your grass seeds like alfalfa, sweet clover, red clover, alsike or white clover. Those were crops that we grew as secondary crops to fertilize the soil. And when we were able to get a portion of that land, we were quite fortunate, because it was land that was quite level. Some had creeks in it, of course, but that comes along with the provisions of Mother Nature.
But when they got their land, they were sort of one of the last waves to come over and get the Rigas, I mean. And so
Yes.
they were given kind of a tough start.
Of course.
Right? Can you tell me a little about that? The Rigas specifically.
Yeah. Okay.
When they came.
When the early settlers came to Canada, the French were the first to be able to pick up the best lands available. Then there were other nationalities that came. I can't name all of them. I know that there were Germans, there was French, there was Ukrainians, and all different nationalities, to partake in this homesteading and trying to take advantage of they used to call it free land one time. It wasn't really for free land because it cost $10 for 160 acres of land. But the fact was that this land was totally raw. It had bush just like this bush over here. There was no development, no nothing. The trails had to be developed. Everybody had to do it by hand. And when I say by hand, I mean by hand.
They show up in a new place. It's hard enough if you have everything given to you, but they show up and they have very rough. And so what would have life been like for the Riga family? I mean, it must have been a struggle just to make ends meet.
Yes, it was. It was very much so. But the fact is, a lot of the settlers that came left the land. They stayed a year or 2 or 3, and then they would leave it because there was really no future to be had from that kind of a situation.
And what about the Riga family?
The Riga family, I guess they were in the same boat. Unless you applied and really put efforts into it, you couldn't exist. You had to move on to a different place, a better place, or whatever you want to call it.
And did they move on?
They did, but after many years. I don't know exactly how long they stayed on their homestead. I would have to say about 25 years minimum on the Riga place. And then, of course, when the children started to get educated, George went into school. He went into further education. So did their daughter. And they moved on to Penticton after that. So from there on, I'm sorry I can't give you too much because I haven't been in immediate contact with George.
Okay. We're just trying to get a sense of what his childhood was like, and we figured you're the guy to tell us.
George's livelihood was not easy. It was not easy for me. It wasn't easy for George. We had to try and make the best of what we could afford and what we could get out of our educational system at the time.
So tell me a little more about the educational system. You're saying it was you had to really grab hold of something and hope that it sticks,
well,
right?
The very first thing is we started, George did and I did, in a one-room school that housed about 50 students, and that was up to from grade 1 to grade 8. And from there on, we had to be divided by the teacher to try and class the students in that school into groups that would kind of work together and exceed as best they could.
And so, can you tell me, just so that we have it on camera, the school doesn't exist anymore, but now what's standing there?
Yes, the school now is it was a single-room school. Then it turned to be a central school at Richmond Park with 3 rooms and 3 teachers, and teaching up to grade 9. What year exactly, I don't remember how long it stayed open, but it eventually got closed down because of the ability for centralization. The roads improved, the buses improved, the school buses, and of course they started to centralize into Athabasca.
Can you tell me some of the jobs that George had as a young man or a kid?
That I can't really give you all that information because
he worked on the bridge.
He applied for a job at the bridge, yes. In 1950, when they started to build the bridge over the Athabasca River into Athabasca, George tried to get a job there, and I guess he did get a job, and that's where he lost his fingers. Now, whether he lost 2 or 3 fingers, I'm not sure. I never saw George since that accident of his. But that's where George got, I guess, probably depressed to a certain point that he said, I've had enough of this. I'm going to look for a future that's going to be more satisfying to myself, because he was a smart boy, and that he could make a livelihood over and above the agricultural business.
So when you say he got depressed and he wanted to find a better life, what was wrong with the life he was living? I mean, it sounds terrible, but what do you think was lacking for him?
You know, I personally, I don't never associated with his dad and his mom that much, because for one reason was I was too young to work with his parents. So, but I think George was unhappy because of the fact that he could not get the answers that he wanted out of life. I think Jordan knew, and he knew that there is a way out, but it was the getting to it, getting the hang of it, or getting the grips of it, to be able to take advantage of the educational system that existed.
Right. So what was the attitude like in Richmond Park, let's say, about a Ukrainian kid who wanted to go off to the big city and make it big? Was there an attitude like, that's not right, you know?
Well, no, I don't think. I think the average individual has a yearning to continue to improve themselves. I think you were in the same boat. I was in the same boat. We wanted to improve ourselves and try and get the best of life that could be provided for myself, yourself, or any other individual.
Do you think it maybe his parents, would you assume that that most farmers, their families want to keep the kids around so that they can work there?
Yes.
So
yes, I think so.
Did you know if there was any sort of issue taken with George going off and becoming a writer of all things?
You know, I can't answer that, guys.
Yeah.
I can't answer that question. I think every parent has the best thinking and the best want for their child. But insofar as the individuals, let's say George's parents, I honestly can't tell you that, because I do know that I knew the George's parents well enough, knowing that they had in the back of their mind, they had a thinking that this is the governing system that they would like to see throughout the country. But that did not materialize, and it never come about, because I think, whether it's totally the political background that hindered that somewhat or whatever, but I don't know. I can't tell you that.
Did you ever think that George Riga would become this massive figure in Canadian?
No, I didn't.
No?
No, I didn't. I always did think that George had the opportunity to advance, I stated that before. Had George supported the government movements within Canada, or maybe even in the United States, that I don't know. But I do know that he could have got financial help a lot more readily than he did from the position that he was in.
And do you think he stayed true to something deep inside, an integrity that he wasn't looking for more money, he was just trying to make something more true and to explore in deep within himself?
That could well be. That could well be. Being a member of a relatively, we might say, poor family, That could well be, but I can't tell you the answer to that.
I have a question.
Yes.
We're going to go back and do some school shots. That building that's still standing where the original Richmond Park School was, the log school.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about that? I know it was you tell me what it was for.
It was for a community that had about 50 children that had to go to school, had to get an education, and I think our parents come to Canada with the thought of betterment for their family, and therefore we all had to go to school in order to take advantage of that educational system. And it was provided for us free of charge. Didn't cost us any money, didn't cost us our parents any money. And therefore, I thought that was a pretty good system all along. And that's why personally I supported our government with many of the programs that they had. I'm not saying that I agreed with all of them, don't get me wrong. But the fact is there was an improvement stepping forward or moving forward because of our educational system.
And there's one building still standing there where the old log school was. You tell me about what the kids put in there.
Oh, well, that was my dad and me built that barn in there to house the horses. That
Tell us about it.
there was 7 of us in the family, in my family, and we all had to go to school, you know. So sending off 7 kids in the bitterness of minus 40 below zero, it was pretty cool. So Dad built us a cutter, a sleigh cutter for the winter. It was kind of it looked like a buggy only on runners instead of wheels. And we used that to take a team of horses to go to school with. From the beginning, Dad would drive us for a few days to school, and then finally figured out, well, it is spending too much time with the children, so we decided to build, and I helped Dad build the barn for a team of horses at the school. And I was getting older enough. I guess I was probably around 12, 14 years old then, and I would take the other 5 kids or 6 kids or whatever amount there was at the time. Not only the family children, but there were neighbors' children that we'd pick up on the way to school to take with the team either a sleigh or a buggy. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are rolling and ready.
What I'd like you to do is tell us about the life of a rock picker, what it was like to be a stone picker, and after that, tell us about Riga's ashes.
First of all, in order to have the rock piles, we had to do the picking. And I was a homesteader. I got my homestead in 1950, and we used to go picking rocks after we seeded the land. And the land, after we seeded it, usually was harrowed, and the harrows would roll out the rocks above on the top surface of the soil. And we would take pails, 5-gallon pails or regular water pails, and go and pick the rocks. And usually what I did in my case is I had a wagon with loose planks on it. That meant it had a floor of loose planks and 2 planks on the edges of the wagon to be able to hold the rocks on the wagon load. We would pick those rocks and haul them off to the side of the field to a rock pile such as what you see here, or else we would haul them, in my case, I would haul them to what we call Deep Creek. And it was a big ravine next to the Athabasca River that we would not have to unload them by hand, but we would usually back the wagon with the loose planks and then lift the planks up and let the rocks fall off the wagon. That saved us a lot of handwork. After that was over, we had the fields fairly clear because we used to cut the grain with binders. And a binder, you know, you had to have it fairly clean cut bottoms so that you can get fairly low in some of the short crops, because, you know, if you cut it off too high, you cut too much seed off. So you try to cut down as close to the ground as possible to get all the seed that's on the plant into a bundle, or else a windrow in the case of, you know, swathing with a swather. That was the reason for using and cutting the land as we did. And not only that, we tried to preserve as much seed as was on the plants, because some of that seed goes down fairly low to the ground level. So you try to swath as low as possible to get all the seed kernels in and into the swather and the combines. In the early days, we did not do too much cutting of we did not grow the crops that we are growing today, because we grew crops more like grain crops, you know, your hay, or I mean your wheat, your oats, your barley, and then we would bundle them up and stook them. Later on, when the swathers come in, that was more of a labor-saving device, but on the other hand, we had to depend a lot more on the land, you know, that was in existence. So,
Tell us about the Riga stone piles.
oh, they had stone piles. There was 5 of them on that quarter section, and most of them were near the northern border of that quarter, because that's where the kind of a rocky ridge run through, and that's where the rocks were turned up. You know, after sealing, like I mentioned before, it was, you would go with the harrows, you would loosen the rocks that were all near the surface, and then we would have to go and pick them off, and not to get them into the combine or the pickups or even the binders. They would be able to be picked up. The smaller rocks especially would be able to, you know, so we can. This here rock pile is a pile of rocks that is fairly large, as you can see it, because those were the rocks that were near the higher surfaces of the land, and they would be picked up and put up into the rock piles such as what you see in the photograph here.
Okay. So the Riga rock piles would have been made of smaller rock?
Very similar. Some smaller and some big ones. There was a rock on one of the quarter sections that I remember. We had a D8 that couldn't roll that rock out of the ground. It was that big. So we had all sizes of rocks, big and small.
So as a boy, you remember George and picking rocks and all
Yeah. When I got married, I had some small children. My son, who is with us here today, and my younger boys and girls, we all would go out into the field with a pail in the hand and go on throughout the whole field, pick off the rocks so that they could be, the grain could be cut clearly above the rocks and be able to be picked up with your pickups or your swathers.
Tell us how hard the work was.
The hard, I tell you, it was pretty hard because there were many a days that I would have to take a bottle of water or a container of water with me, and I had to have a drink every few minutes because it was quite hard, quite hot, I mean. And we were sweating, our eyebrows were dripping with sweat.
You tell us about the spreading of George Riga's his ashes?
I was not there in person, but I do know David Ivashuk, and I don't know if he had a friend with him or not, but when George's body was cremated, I guess his wish, according to Nick Ivashuk, wanted to be buried or spread on the rock piles that existed on the Riga farm. So they took his ashes, and there were 5 different rock piles on that quarter section, and they spread some of the ashes on each one of the piles. Now the piles have been buried by the bigger operators that took over the land, and of course his ashes got buried with the rock piles that were on the land.
Do you think there's something tragic or poetic about that?
I don't know. Insofar as I knew the Riga family, they were not churchgoers. I don't know what their belief was. I don't know what faith they would have preferred, but I do know that they were not churchgoers.
What do you think George would say if he knew that the rocks got buried again with his ashes on them? Try and guess.
I honestly don't know. I don't know the individual's mind and his mind of thinking. So I couldn't answer that question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry about a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was great.
Yeah, good.
I'm sorry I can't help you anymore. I did it
Sorry at all.
as far as I know, that was my way and my involvement with George Riga. I kind of am sorry till this day that I didn't associate with George till his passing, because I knew George very well as a friend, as a schoolmate, and I read a lot of his writings, and I think he was an excellent individual. He was a very smart individual, coming up with some of the writings and some of the words and that he has put, or some of his writings that he put into words in his writing. I think he did a marvelous job.
Okay.
So you liked his work?
Oh yes, I think he meant well. Like I've said before, I'm not sure that George believed in supporting the political movement in Canada, regardless which part it may be, but he certainly, I think, took into his mind, and he was considering his co-friends and his neighbors, that he actually cared for their livelihood.
Yeah, there's definitely that.
I think he honestly did. He had, he was a smart enough boy to have that, or whether it come naturally to him or not, I don't know, but it certainly goes to show that he certainly had the feeling that it required for a consideration of your fellow friends or neighbors, for that matter.
All right.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you so much.